Yeah, that's right, John. So the proposal under consideration could also have the effect of increasing tensions between D.C. and Kyiv, which Moscow, of course, favors after past conflicts between U.S. and Ukrainian leaders. As the peace talks continue, doubts about trusting Putin, though, of course, remain. For more on this, let's bring in Fox News senior strategic analyst, General Jack Keane. Sir, talk to us about this standalone security guarantee that they are now discussing. As I understand it, it sounds like the European leaders would commit to protecting Ukraine as if it were a member of NATO, though they don't actually get to be one in the future should Putin try to invade again. But they could have protected Ukraine as if it were a member of NATO this time around, and nobody seems to have done that. So why would anybody pin their hopes to that in the future?
Well, I think a number of things have happened. And first of all, Putin himself, he has not moved one iota from his strategic objectives in terms of Russia's sphere of influence in Europe. He really does want to return to the Russian Empire, and he really does want much of the Eastern European countries who used to be a part of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. He really wants them to return under the control of Russia. That's the reality of what he is about. And the anchor and centerpiece for him doing that is Ukraine, given the size of the country, the wealth of the country, and the fact that in 2014 it was moving so aggressively to the West to join the EU and also seeking to be a part of the political and military alliance of NATO. He resented that. His guy that was running the country was aligned with him. The people revolted against that and actually ran that puppet out of Ukraine as their president. That's precipitated the annexation of Crimea and bringing troops into eastern Ukraine. He has not budged from any of that. And I think the Europeans, having seen this now, for 42 months, that Russia is dead set on taking control of Ukraine, despite the fact they only hold 19% of it. They want to topple the government, take control of it, and as they have said time and time again, and the Europeans believe them, is that they want to expand into Eastern Europe and break the transatlantic alliance between the United States and Europe, which is called NATO. They know that he is about those objectives, and he has not changed. So they had to wake up. You betcha they've had to wake up. Two things have happened. One is Putin's behavior, and the second thing is Trump. He went and laid it right at him and said, look you've got to stand up for yourself here. You've been dependent on the security umbrella of the United States, for all these multiple decades. You have got to face this thing yourself. And Trump was threatening leave. And I don't think he ever really intended to leave, to be frank. He understands the strategic importance of it. But he wanted to get their attention, and he's got their attention. And they're sincere about building their defense budgets beyond 2%, going towards 5%. They are sincere about providing serious security guarantees to include European forces on the ground. They believe the fact that Putin has not given up. And despite a peace agreement, he would likely reattack again, possibly not in the Trump administration, but for certain after. Yeah, they are dead serious about wanting to be a part of something that's real. International forces backed up by air power, put as much military capability in Ukraine as we can. China, Iran, and North Korea will do the same for Russia, and be prepared to deter Russia significantly. Can Russia be deterred? Will Russia conduct an attack on European forces there with the United States participating and risk war with the United States and Europe? I doubt that seriously.
So let me ask you this question,
Look
General.
at the struggle he's having. One more point.
Yeah.
One more point. Look at the struggle he's having with Ukraine's military. The European forces plus Ukraine plus the United States, there's no match there. There's not even a fair fight. Russia gets defeated, and they know it.
Yeah, well, that's the point that I was about to ask you is, they're worried that Putin might attack. Attack with what? I mean, anything short of nuclear weapons It's going to fail on the battlefield against the NATO forces. So why would he even try it?
Yeah. And the other thing, John, I mean, if he takes Ukraine, which is what he wants to do, Ukraine is the strongest military in Europe, by far, stronger than all of those leaders who just walked through that door,
Yep.
stronger than every military in their country. The only one that can compare to it is the Turkish military, and they don't have the wartime experience and the technological renovations that Ukraine has made. Putin gets all of that. He gets their defense industry, he gets their innovation, he gets all their weapons, and he certainly would force their people to help him in any conflict. Big stakes here for sure, but the Europeans, give them some credit. Finally, they've woken up here, and they see the threat for what it is. That's why there's a lot riding on this meeting that's ongoing right now, and I hope that they can come up with something that's realistic.
General, thank you for taking time with us again. Always learn a lot from listening to your insights. We appreciate you.
Thanks, General.
Yeah, great talking to you, Jillian and John. Thank you.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.